Hello, I am very glad to meet you here. I am Triin Roosalu, a sociologist at Tallinn University, Estonia. And together with colleagues, we are going to discuss the matters related to applying capability approach in the research of labor markets, vocational education, and skills mismatch. So without further ado, I will introduce my guests. We have a sociologist, Petja Iljeva-Trishkova, who works in Bulgarian Academy of Sciences. She's associate professor at the Institute of Philosophy and Sociology there in Sofia. Welcome, Petja. We have Philip Grollman, who is a professor in the field of education in the context of work and occupations in Germany, in Dortmund University. Welcome. And we have Emily Eriksson, so a research fellow in England at the Institute of Employment Research in University of Warwick. Welcome. We have been struggling to figure out how does capability approach fit into the overall picture of researching and understanding this field, the vast field, which is of great interest to all of us professionally, but also as a citizen, which is inequalities in labor market and in education. So what does this approach add? But let me start with a more personal question. So as a scholar of this field, how do you see what is the distinct aspect of capability approach that makes it very different compared to all other theoretical approaches that you're applied? So what is the distinct feature of capability approach for you? And I would like to start with Petja, because she has been writing the most, I would say, on this theme over the years. So Petja, the floor is yours.
Yeah, and thank you very much, Triin. So where to start? Overall, we have to always consider that the capability approach is a normative framework for conceptualizing, measuring, and evaluating such phenomenon as inequalities, well-being, human development, and education. And in my view, really the essence of the approach is that it focuses not just on the actual achievements of people or the so-called functionings, but also on the freedom and the opportunities which people have to achieve for what they have reason to value, or the so-called capabilities. What is also important for the approach is that it really allows us to acknowledge the human diversity. And this implies that different people have different capacities to transform the resources which they have into real agency, freedoms, and achievements. And also it allows us to take into account the human agency and the fact that people are not just recipients of policies and interventions, but they can also act and bring about change. And last but not least, it really allows us to acknowledge what each individual values. And thus it highlights really spaces of inequalities which are hidden if we use other metrics, for instance, utilities or resources.
Thank you. So you're focusing, your focus on diversity is really interesting to me, because it seems, yes, what more logical could it be? But we really tend to assume people to be very similarly minded and wanting the same things, and then also valuing the same things very often. So as sociologist, I understand where you're coming from. So that also raises a good question for me to ask Philip, who's more in the political kind of system studies angle person. Philip, what do you see as a distinct feature or something special about this capability approach?
Yeah, thank you, Trine, for this question. I think I was always actually attracted, let's say, by the capability approach, but never had any reason why I should go deeper into this. And therefore, this project was a good opportunity to get a little better acquainted with the capability approach and its, let's say, advantages and disadvantages, its challenges and its potentials. And for me, who is specifically interested in education and vocational education in particular, I think one of the assets of the approach is that it does not only look at the question how people are functioning, let's say, within the labor market, which is, of course, a very important perspective for someone who deals with vocational education and training. But what is as important is that people are not only functioning, but that they also develop themselves, that they develop a certain sense of identity. And I think the capability approach is to some extent able to cover both ends of this, let's say, continuum of only functioning on the one hand and being yourself and developing your identity on the other hand. So that's quite attractive. And makes the capability approach as a good, let's say, approach to study vocational education processes. It also looks at personal freedoms, which is a very important perspective in this regard. And then what I also enjoyed when trying to make use of the approach is its great openness. That's something that is stressed by the different authors that I read. Beyond Sen and Nussbaum, there's, as I learned, a huge body of literature in the meantime. And I found it quite interesting that many of those who have applied it and who wrote about the capability approach said that it is specifically useful as a framework of research. So it's not a kind of closed theory that looks at causal relationships between one or the other entity, but it's more kind of an open framework that also has some normative assumption within that are very useful when looking at vocational education and training. Especially, I think the idea of freedom, of justice and individual agency, they are quite pronounced in this framework, and that is also attractive when using it for vocational education and training.
Yeah, thank you. Also, thank you for bringing in that the project really invited us to look at these approaches, even if we normally were not necessarily working in this. So I'm also intrigued by when you said this more open nature of that framework is actually helpful, because sometimes people doing these empirical work are more worried about very open approaches, but this framework really seems to be useful with its openness, as far as I understand. You also were pointing out its normative assumptions, and that is something that I believe this capability approach is kind of really prominent in its value-based normative assumptions, whereas all the other theoretical approaches and conceptual approaches probably do also have some normative assumptions in them, but they tend to be so already widely accepted, so they remain not explicit but only inherent. So this approach seems to be really, as you're saying, be more open not just as a framework, but also more open about their normativity. I think we will have space to also discuss the potential dangers of such normativity. So would you want to comment on that a bit? Have you experienced some dangers related to that, or?
Yes, and that's probably it is also a possibility of involving Emily into the conversation, because when we were looking at how we can apply the capability approach to issues of vocational education and training curriculum, there was it was a challenge to really operationalize the approach in a way that is empirically valid also in our specific setting, in a cross-national or comparative setting, because you might have certain values that are put up front by the capability approach that in terms of their, let's say, cultural and societal operationalization might be quite different from one society to another. So there we found certain limitations in, let's say, the bindingness of the approach, which would sometimes have been helpful.
Yeah, thank you. So, Emily, the question to you, what is to you the distinct feature of capability approach?
Yeah, thank you. It's a pleasure to be part of this conversation and to kind of just echo that, what a pleasure it's been to be part of this broader project where we get to look at these issues from various perspectives and try to then come at some broader conclusions from it. I think for me, one of the kind of strengths or interests in the capability approach lies in that focus that's already been kind of flagged before, but this idea about kind of freedoms, but also freedoms within context, because as I understand it, it's a bit like it encourages us to move beyond simply kind of counting outcomes or resources and to ask whether people are able to kind of convert that into meaningful lives that they want, that they, that reflect the value that they want it to have. And so I think that kind of normative emphasis on agency is quite powerful for vet research, because it can highlight whether our systems will enable people or not to not only get the skills and acquire them, but deploy them, develop them, be able to use them in the workplace and beyond in a way that's meaningful for their lives. So I found that quite impactful in the work. And I think the idea of these kind of freedoms within context would help me. It aligned with some of the work we've done elsewhere on this kind of circular skills ecosystems, where we also try to situate skill development within local institutions and social structures and deployment. And I think that, that might reflect that my training is actually as an urban planner in the economic geography tradition. So kind of looking at that, what are these local constraints or opportunities that we might have, and how can we actually utilize things? So, kind of long way around, I think, that the appeal is quite clear about the capabilities approach, but not necessarily as a replacement for others, but I think it brings it adds to that diversity of perspectives. And I think it's just generally a great reminder that, for other models where we might think about wage returns or something of those, right, that's not necessarily the goal in and of itself, but it's a representation of what are often those normative goals that you were speaking about, those about kind of freedom, agency, and ability to use it outside of the labor market. So I think that's what I appreciated about learning and then applying the capabilities approach.
Yes, thank you. So this reminder that it's not necessarily bad to also look at wages, but not to take wages as a goal in itself, but a means to get something else that we value. Even though sometimes we may use our agency to value the wages and find joy of these. So that is about the diversity. You mentioned of perspectives, and Petja mentioned of people as such. So just to acknowledge both ways are possible, but you were also bringing in the idea of ecosystems and generally how systems are enabling or actually limiting people in their capability. So is there something that makes a system more likely to have the freedom of doing the stuff they need or think is important, as opposed to like a person whose capability we can imagine and understand? So what does it take from institutions not to do, or from the systems not to do the stuff, or to do the stuff? So what about these institutional agency? Would capability approach be also explaining that?
I was thinking that what the capability approach allows us, both with regards to lifelong learning and to that, is to consider that they are determined by factors at different levels. At micro, that's the individual level; the meso, that's the level of the educational institutions or the learning providers, and the macro, that's the national level, where we can consider the economic, social, and cultural development in a given country. But also talking about ecosystem, this approach allows us to take into account the interactions between the different levels and how they interact, how they influence on the, let's say, participation in lifelong learning, or in vocational education and training. And in this way, it really allows us to review how lifelong learning and VET are embedded in different social and institutional contexts, and how these contexts frame lifelong learning and VET activities and the learner experiences.
Yes, thank you, Petja. Philip?
Yeah, I think that's a little bit what Petja has just described, is a little bit what we have tried to do in one of the papers that we have produced within the Skills to Capability project, where we have applied the capability approach to the different levels of curriculum. And of course, this is not only the kind of differentiation into, let's say, macro, meso, and micro level, but it also relates to questions of differentiating, let's say, a conceptual level on the one hand from the empirical level on the other hand. So, for example, if you look at what we in our approach called then the intended curriculum level, which is a very normal category within curriculum research, then you would probably rather look at the question in how far the concepts of the curriculum do match with, let's say, the aspirations of the capability approach. Whereas if you, for example, look at the realized level of curriculum, you can turn into a more empirical observation. So in how far do learners reach certain freedoms or certain options that they would like to see, and you can actually measure this. So what I want to say is it can be a tool that can be used to empirical analysis on the one hand, but also to conceptual analysis on the other hand, which again makes it a rich instrument for, let's say, cross-national comparisons, but also again a very demanding one.
Yes, thank you. So I like this idea of bringing in this two different dimensions of the level. So yes, there is a micro, meso, macro, but there is also this conceptual versus empirical. So to point that out is really useful, and probably then also just methodological, as in how is it even possible to measure what you were saying, both of those aspects, right? So this is something that makes it this approach also appealing, but also difficult. So it is also demanding. So what does it mean that it is actually demanding, other than, okay, we have to take everything in account? So this is conceptually open framework. So of course we have to take everything in account, but how else is it complicated? because of course we can't take everything in account normally. It's very difficult.
Well, I think if I could jump in with a few ideas to that, I think a couple that have already been mentioned, and one is around just operationalizing some of these concepts and to be able to do so at scale so that we have kind of comparisons. I think as Philip even was mentioning, right, at those international comparisons, it's if there's existing data sets out there that are available and we can use other frameworks to make these analyses quite simpler, that what on employment or qualification achievements and wages, earnings, etc. But that makes other models much more useful. So I think there's a challenge in operationalizing, but I also think there's a risk of trying to operationalize and measure things like freedom, but relying on proxies that are too similar to more traditional human capital models. And then we end up actually maybe replicating those same logics, but in a different format and calling it something else. And I think then it can get quite muddled. And I know I find it then quite difficult to really understand what is different or what is new. If it's about the potential to have the agency and the freedom based on what those proxy measures, then that's one thing. But if you're actually measuring, do you have those freedoms and opportunities? And I think that's a bit more of a challenge. And then, as I flagged, at scale. So that's where I would start with kind of the difficulties in applying, is those operationalizing, bringing that to scale, and having kind of large scale comparative pieces.
Yes, thank you. I think it was very important also for whatever research we have been doing in this project, and both these large-scale comparison needs, as also was mentioned before, but especially that we think we measure something, then maybe it's not the thing, or maybe it actually looks more like more traditional approaches, and so where does one cross a line in terms of what do we see what is happening, and then, okay, is it really a sign of freedom, or is it a sign of a limitation? So does that mean that this conceptual openness of that framework just allows us to say this is that? How do we solve this problem? Or shall we just keep this problem and try to live with that it may look like something else too?
I was thinking of what both Emily and Philip said. So we have available a lot of large scale cross-national surveys, and they are very rich in terms of empirical basis that we can use in our analysis, but we also have to consider that these surveys, let's say adult education survey or labor force survey or the European skills and job survey, they are not designed to following the capability approach framework. So always when we use data and measures from these surveys, we are using some proxies of what we really want to measure. And usually these surveys do not cover questions about the values of people or the differences in the different differences in the quality of the forms of education, let's say, and we really have to consider this both as an opportunity to apply the approach, but also as a limitation that we can't really use it in the way that we intended to do so. And in this sense, capability approach could really provide us as a lens to rethink the data from large-scale surveys and to better uncover their analytical potential towards understanding different dimensions, let's say, of lifelong learning or on vocational education and training. But if we really want to apply the approach to these studies, we have to start developing our own scales, developing our own questionnaires, and think of other questions which fit, which are more in line into the conceptual framework.
Yes, thank you. This idea of the fact that there is so many surveys already and so many different data sets already that are perfect, except that they are not perfect for the approach we want to take. So when you say we need to start developing our own questions, who is that we that you have in mind? Is there a community of people who are actually doing this? How is this idea of those large-scale comparative surveys even fitting with the mainstream of capability approach? So we are taking something from that approach. So yeah, who is that we? Who would be that we to develop those?
Well, I would say that both researchers and, of course, in collaboration with different stakeholders, this could definitely be done. It's just that we are having nowadays a lot of data available, but when we think about evidence-based policies, or I mean, going to this direction, that we really want to have some evidence to develop good suggestions for policy improvement. We really also have to consider that we have to improve our instruments, how we measure things, how we to have developments also in this area, in the area of measurement and data collection.
Yes, so of course, as you were saying, we need to improve the instruments, especially if we want to make the policy relevant conclusions and suggestions. So I think that also relates to the normative aspect, of course, not only of the capability approach, but of research as such. So when we are studying education and inequalities in labor market and skills mismatches, so we want this other aspect, this normative aspect that comes from the capability approach, to be also informing the policy decisions, right? So to see, even though when I'm thinking back to the project, so one of the key questions to me was that the project said that it is helping the institutions to see how they can support, if they are to support people in doing their choices, in making their choices, because it is not a given that normatively the policy decisions want to be based on the capability approach. So that seems to be a little conundrum still. So let me just continue with the question on the relevance of capability approach to the research in the field of education and skills mismatch. So you were saying before about generally how it is good and important, and what are the empirical difficulties, but yeah, especially to the field of education and skills and their mismatches. So Philip, do you want to take it from here?
Mm-hmm. When I was preparing myself for this discussion, I was a little thinking about the question how or what particular value the capability approach could bring into the research of skills mismatch. And then what I had as an idea, what we probably partly also did within the project, is that we probably shouldn't see skills mismatch only as a societal problem, which of course it is. And of course we need to make sure that the vocational and the educational system and the lifelong learning system produce somehow the skills that are required in economy. But on the other hand, it is probably also quite natural that, and even impossible, to always produce exactly what the labor market would need. So in a way, mismatch is also a normality. It probably is different to a different extent, a normality between different societies, but it's also a normality. And there it might be useful again to apply the, let's say, categories and also the normative foundations of the capability approach, because of course you have processes of somehow adapting organizations to individuals and the other way around, and individuals who actually probably adapt the organizations to the needs of them and so on. And then the capability approach is probably more useful than other economic approaches of looking at this, because it provides this room and agency to individuals, and it also directs, let's say, the perspective towards those processes. So that might be an interesting point, to say that skill mismatch is always also kind of the incentive that develops learning. So without any mismatch, you wouldn't have learning. And then the capability approach might be more appropriate of looking at those learning processes than other more economist approaches, let's say.
Yes, very interesting. So this idea that skills mismatch is itself an incentive that develops the need for learning and lifelong learning, but also that we cannot even imagine that we are fully preparing the workforce at school level, and then they are ready to all the endeavors that are facing the labor market and their employers. So that not only is it not possible, but it probably isn't desirable in the cases where the economy and society changes very much, as we claim to be experiencing now. So in this context of changes, we probably cannot even really imagine the full compliance between these skills and jobs. So how do we then think about, is there also a way to think about overskilling not as a problem for society as such? Because what you were referring now was more like underskilling, like if you don't have enough skills for the labor market or the job. So how would we then see, or would there be a way that we could look at overskilling as not a big problem?
I'll jump in on that and say, I think part of it is about the choice and the agency the individual has. If they're working below, if they have more skills than is expected of them, is that because they're choosing to work in a different field outside of their training? Is that because they were for some reason blocked into being able to move into, because we still know that discrimination and activities like that occur in the labor market for all sorts of instances. So I think there's an element of trying to understand and untangle, what does it mean to be overqualified or overskilled in your field? And is that what element of that is the problem that we want to address through policy? Because, if I take a different approach to my life, then that's my choice. And how do we kind of detangle that? I think from large-scale data sets is of course a challenge. I think that one of the other elements of the mismatch, which I think is interesting to consider possibly through the capability approach, is the role of utilization and kind of what happens at the workplace. We oftentimes, I think, see that it's just a bit of a black box. An individual gets the skills and then goes off to work, and they're either over or underskilled or it's the Goldilocks of being perfectly aligned. And then there's some economic returns, but that's probably overly simplifying things, because also at work we should, in theory, have the opportunities for ongoing development and training. There's questions about how much agency we're given at the job site to be able to deploy our skills, come up with new approaches to work processes and job design. So I think there's something around kind of the development and deployment of your skill in your at work, that is potentially maybe that there's something that the capability approach can bring us in to looking at that in ways that that's often overlooked, I think, in a lot of the traditional research veins, that it's not just about the matching through hiring at that moment, but there's something else maybe that we need to think about with skills and utilization.
Yes, thank you for bringing this this aspect in, as in not only to what extent there is a choice, but also that there are different points where one person even doing the same one job can be changing in their being a match at the hiring, or also at 2 years later, or at taking the on more responsibilities. So there is this way to look at the mismatch, but also the overskill as something that develops over time. So you were also mentioning this workplace to really be a black box for us as researchers, maybe also policymakers, because that there seems to be a lot of attention to other things than what the skills levels are. When I bring in this idea of skills mismatch as something that we could even untie from job or labor market thing, does that sound like a relevant idea here from the context of capability approach? So as in, you may be overskilled for a job, but that doesn't mean it's a waste for a society to have educated you, because you can apply those skills in other fields than labor market. So would that be a convincing argument to policymaking point of view when we take the capability as a framework to explain it? Because perhaps other frameworks would see it more as a problem.
Well, I think that if people have chosen to work on jobs which are under their level of education, and this is really what they have reason to value, then it's not a problem, because education as a whole, it's not only about the labor market, it's also for improving the well-being of people, both their own well-being, it can be also others people well-being, it can be also the well-being at national level. Sometimes people, due to their family responsibilities, for instance, women, they prefer to take jobs which are closer to their home, which allow them to combine the work and home activities. But for me, it's always the skill mismatch is a problem when it's not desirable. It's not what people really want to do. And when we think of it, we don't have to think only of it as an economic insufficiency, but really as a barrier for people's fundamental capabilities, as it may prevent people from developing their capability to have a decent job and for high quality work. And through capability approach, we could really conceptualize the skill mismatch as the lack of correspondence between the acquired level of skills, qualification, education, by the individual, and the required level of skills, education, qualification required for the job, which may lead to capability deprivation, which may have wider consequences for the individual than just instrumental and economic ones, such as it may have consequences on their well-being or on the active citizenship. And also it might influence on the societies and societal level with regard, for instance, on the inclusive economic growth.
That sounds really important, that we could be able to see that something is desirable, but it is also possible that we could design the jobs that are still matching my previous level of education to also be work family friendly, right? So there could be a way that we imagine that, but we are already not imagining that, because we're so thinking and working in this in the frameworks that are prepared by other approaches. So in the sense that leads to me asking, to what extent do you see that this capability approach is really possible to be reconciled with these other approaches that have been governing the field of research in education and labor market longer? Let's put it that way. So to what extent this capability approach just adds to what there is, or has the aspiration of really replacing of what there is? So what is the potential of capability approach with the other approaches, to work with the other approaches in making sense of the field of learning and skills mismatches?
There's a little bit of confusion for me as someone who has worked since quite some time on vocational education and training, because we have and that was also part of the conference we all visited, the end of project conference, where there was the intervention that it might be better to talk about competence. And this is just something that I wanted to throw in. There is a little bit of the problem that they are very similar. The term competence and the term capability, they are very similar. For example, they are similar in the sense that they both share that they have somehow a perspective on internal dispositions, like abilities, knowledge, and so on. But on the other hand, they also look at the outer world. They look at possibilities of applying certain knowledge or applying certain qualifications and so on. So they are similar in that regard. They are terms that look at internal dispositions on the one hand, which is basically an issue of education, of learning, development, and so on. But on the other hand, they also look at the possibilities of realizing certain individual potential that is there. And that makes it a little tricky to apply that to vocational education and training. This is something that we cannot solve, but it's quite interesting, I find. So something that we can probably take with us. But the other point is that I nevertheless, no matter if we are talking about competence or capabilities, where capabilities would probably relate a little stronger to, let's say, societal issues, whereas competence would more look at more psychological and educational issues, they can be combined quite well with other approaches in vocational education and training. So, for example, there is things like the recognition theory is interesting when you look at development of individual and vocational identity. And then it might be useful to use the competence theory or the capability approach. Both of them might be interesting in combining them with, for example, recognition theory. It might also be interesting to look at theories of let's say, work-based or work-integrated learning, like situated learning. How does that relate to capabilities? It would be opening an interesting space for, let's say, more qualitative inquiries. as opposed to those that Petja was mentioning earlier, where you would look at certain indicators on a societal level. You could also look in how far the notion of capabilities is embedded into organizational learning or so, and then you would probably use theories of situated learning. So there's different possibilities of making complementary relationships between different approaches, and I think it's also a necessity. For me, a little bit of the learning is that you can't use the capability approach as such, because it might be too open, actually, for some of the issues that we want to look at. And last point, I'm interested to hear about the other colleagues' opinion on the potential complementarity of human capital approach and capability approach. My impression is that they are not so complementary as sometimes is being written. Because I had the pleasure to look at some of the writings of Zen, because I really wanted to go a little deeper, and then I found that he's really quite critical about this issue. And that was new to me, because often it is transferred that they are well complementary. My impression was they are not so much, but it's probably not an issue that is so important for me. I don't know, but I would be interested in your assessments on this.
Yeah, thank you. So, Petja, I'll give floor to you.
Yeah,
What about the relationship between the tension?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with what Philip said, that it's good the capability approach to be combined with other approaches, other theories when it comes to educational research. With regard to the human capital theory, I also think that capability approach really complements it. It's not a rival of the human capital approach, because it considers not only the instrumental value of education, but also that it has other values, such as an intrinsic one, such as a transformative and empowering one, and it can play also roles at both individual and at national level. Also, I have also combined the capability approach with other approaches in educational research. So, for instance, in the case of studies on social justice and adult learning, some years ago, we combined with my colleague the capability approach with the John Rawls theory of justice as fairness. And this allowed us to conceptualize social justice in adult learning as a complex phenomenon, which has not only fairness dimension, but also an inclusion dimension. So this kind of combination of the capability approach with other theories when it comes to educational research, I think is very useful and very innovative, and really enriches both the research and has important policy implications when it comes then to policy implications.
Yeah, thank you. So this idea, so you're saying that the human capital approach and capability approach are complementary to each other, so they can be seen at the same time, at the same place. So thank you. And Philip said before that they don't even seem to be complementary, as in they are very different approaches, right? So okay, so you can look at them in a different, like as Emily said before, diversity of approaches to be there, but that they shouldn't probably be looked at with the same question if we follow the original two routes. So Emily, what is your take there? So do you see these as more like a good fit to add to the perspective, or rather incompatible approaches?
Well, I think those are somewhat different questions. One is whether or not they add to our perspective, and one is, can we use them simultaneously to address the same question? And I think for the second part of that, no, like the human capital models traditional human capital models, the capability approach, as far as I understand, they rely on different logics. They would ask different questions. So to use them simultaneously, I think there would likely be quite a bit of tension, but that doesn't mean that we can't use elements to help explain the whole. So that's where my initial thoughts are about whether it's complementary in the very precise sense or in the more general. Because I just think, if we're asking research questions about, market mechanisms and efficiency, that's one thing. But if we're looking at individual and collective well-being, we're getting at different objectives there. So I think there would be a tension at trying to apply the same thing, but that doesn't mean that there aren't market mechanisms at play embedded within a capabilities approach. So I just think maybe there's a bit of kind of difficult nuance that has to be teased out there. So, but I do also think that there's oftentimes an over-reliance maybe on a very simplified approach of human capital theory, where it's we have a market, it exchanges, but those markets aren't universal. And there's local contexts, there's different occupational field-specific context that matters. And so I think we are right to challenge and push the boundaries of these kind of big behemoths in the field, of kind of theoretical underpinnings that, as Trine, I think, was alluding to earlier, that are so universal. It's like a fish in water. You don't even realize it's there. It's because it's everywhere. But I think there's a benefit in having them work together, because it forces us to ask the question differently. But that doesn't mean that we can use the same approaches and methods. But it's encouraging us to kind of push the box further.
Yeah, thank you. So it does seem like a good idea to also use the capability approach to remind us of the more possible nuances within the human capital approach that has kind of gone or like lost on the way somehow. Because as you said, we tend to simplify, and it is not possible with capability approach to keep the simplify aspect. So no matter to what extent we want to do it. I am kind of noticing the time. So there is the question that I want to also address, and I think it goes a little from this what you said, Emily, in your last answer. So this idea of we could do more with this approach, to ask more of the existing approaches, right? So that they would be more multi-faced. So then the question here would be how what would it be needed? So what would you suggest is needed so that capability approach would gain more traction in theorizing and conceptualizing empirical research in this field of our focus today, so education and skills mismatches, so that it could be informing also policy decisions, and so what would it take to get capability approach to ask more of the existing governing approaches, but also suggest that the policy decisions would also be, and when I say policy, it also means employers, so that they wouldn't be the black box. But yeah, and let me throw that question into the air. So Philip, would you?
My impression is that it would be a worthwhile endeavor to further look into more, let's say, micro and case study based research in regard to this question, in order to add to the literature that is already available on the level of indicators and so on. And it might, I mean, it might be I'm unsure, actually, I have to say, but in case that we wanted to further develop this, I would opt very much for doing more research on the more micro level foundations of the capability approach. Don't know if that's an answer to your question.
Yeah, so if I do understand correctly, then the idea is that if we look at more of the micro level things of also capability approach, we would be more convincing, showing the actual connections rather than when we have to use those proxies very much when we do the ecosystem level or the country level or comparative large scale stuff. So that's where you're alluding. So because it's more
also also in order to showcase that there is additional things to strive for in addition to wages and so on, which are of course a necessity in order to make a living. But on the other hand, we are also living in societies where there is the possibility to also develop society at other ends, let's say, than only the material end. And this probably could be stronger showcased by more micro level examinations of what people are doing at work, for example, under which conditions they feel well, what education could contribute to this, and so on. It is a little bit in our final project conference, there was this issue discussed about occupational prestige and wages. And there was this point that, of course, they relate to each other, but there might also be jobs that have high prestige, but not that high wages. And this kind of interrelations, they are quite interesting, I think.
Yeah, thank you. And especially, coming from a post-socialist country, I think, Peter, you can also say it. So since we had these changes in the system, the structural relevance of certain jobs is still high with the prestige, but yeah, the salary is totally not competitive. So that's very, very understandable. So Petya, yes, the question to you.
Yeah, I was thinking exactly about the teachers in Bulgaria who are with high prestige, but with little, not so high income. Nowadays, there's some improvement of their salaries, but still, it's what's called status inconsistency, where you really have a high prestige and low income of what you are doing. I was thinking that for the CA to get more influence, let's say, in the empirical research and also in policy, we really need better understanding of its potential and limitations. And what I could in general say from policy implications that I've seen from CA literature, specifically about education, is that they are really much richer, they are more human-centered, they are really very sensitive to the context, they really capture the diversity of the people, they acknowledge what people value, the quality of the educational opportunities, and usually they don't look at one aspect of life, but look at, for instance, the quality of life more as a multidimensional perspective. And also there is a need to realize what Emily has mentioned, that it's important what questions we ask. Obviously, a capability approach cannot answer all questions. It can help in some, but it definitely cannot answer all question. But could definitely show us and highlight spaces of inequalities, of injustices, which in other approaches may be hidden.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Petja. Yes, the approach, the capability approach, then would help us to show things also that other approaches really are less prepared to do. So that is how it can be like complementary to these current approaches. Yes, thank you. So Emily, what about capability approach can we do so that it would be more everywhere?
Yeah, I think to touch on something that Philip brought up earlier about and that Petja brought up even earlier than that. One was the need for kind of small local case studies that really bring out the depth and potential. I think there is some richness in there, but I think also to be able to then link that to the need for larger scale data sets that Petja already flagged as well, because currently our kind of pan-European surveys, they're not, as Petja was saying, they don't ask about the capability, they're not using that framework, so they're not asking those questions. So I wonder if there's maybe a potential to kind of grow up from these micro case studies that kind of help us operationalize and kind of proof of concept that these things actually these are the ways we can measure the outcomes that we're interested in the capabilities approach. And then this is how we could then implement that on a large scale, potentially. That's just my very practical brain trying to link up my colleagues' very insightful comments earlier. But I also just think there's kind of I think that the capabilities approach has a compelling argument in kind of pushing the question further, because I feel like I've been in conversations quite often where we're talking about vet systems and skills policy, and it's often focused on like, well, we're not supplying the economy or the labor market with the skills they need. Employers have said they need this, we're not providing enough, and as though that in and of itself were the end. And I think there's a tendency to forget that economies exist to serve people and not the other way around, and that maybe this is just me being a bit naive about and taking a surface level understanding of the capabilities approach, but I think it really kind of pushes us to think about it in another way, about instead of the economy or the labor market being the goal, what does that allow us to do as kind of a society? What are the capabilities that we can foster collectively, which I think is also maybe another angle that's quite interesting about thinking about the kind of collective skills and capabilities that we can develop in our communities to then convert that into kind of large scale well-being efforts. So I think that is a very compelling hook to me to kind of think through how can we reframe some of our other questions and adapt our approaches to make sure that we're keeping those goals in mind, and to not kind of stay just riding the kind of traditional course because that is the way it's always been. So that's a bit kind of all over the place on my response to this. Apologies, but yeah, so I think there's great potential. Yeah,
thank you. So that sounds really good. That's really a good positive point where to also leave us in the sense that okay, there is the possibility to grow up. Is what you were saying, like from the smaller cases, from insightful, clearer, smaller cases, to operationalize into larger explorations and comparisons, but also this, as you gently put it, there is a tendency to forget that economy is not the goal. So, and maybe there's something else than that, and so capability approach could help us to just sneak that perspective in, or as we said before, to ask more of the approaches that are already used, but who maybe have more nuance in the past that we have now faded out. I also liked very much a point of collective capabilities. So we are now so used to talking about social capital as something that we can measure at all kinds of levels. Also, so that brings brings me to also conclude that we can look at the capabilities as also a collective feature, so and the feature of collectives. So that is another way of looking at those. It was really interesting for me to hear how you're thinking now after the 3 years of fully working on this project and another year of being in preparation of this project. And I really enjoyed it. So thank you so much for this capabilities approach. And I'm glad I was capable to hear you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.